There are children who don't play make-believe for fun. They play to stay alive. They build worlds not from imagination, but from necessity. They disappear into the invisible, into pages, daydreams, invented friends, because the real world was too sharp, too loud, too unpredictable. These are the fantasy children. And though they grow up, the world they built inside never really dissolves. It waits behind their eyes, beneath their calm. For the next moment, reality feels too heavy to bear. To understand the fantasy child is to understand a nervous system that learned early. I am not safe here. When safety isn't found in touch, in tone, in consistency, the mind begins to construct an alternate landscape, a realm of control and wonder, where love is unconditional, endings are kind, and pain obeys narrative logic. It's not delusion, it's design, the psyche's most elegant form of protection. Neuropsychologically, this is a masterpiece of adaptation. When the amygdala screams danger and the prefrontal cortex can't yet mediate the storm, imagination steps in as regulator. Daydreaming releases dopamine, oxytocin, even endogenous opioids. In fantasy, the child's body finds chemical relief from emotional starvation. The mind becomes its own medicine. Imagination becomes anesthesia for the ache of unmet needs. But every adaptation, no matter how brilliant, becomes a burden when overused. The fantasy child learns to self-soothe without repair, to comfort themselves without comforters. They don't just escape into stories, they inhabit them. And when they grow, they carry that invisible duality, one foot in the tangible, one in the imagined. Reality becomes an intermittent visit. In adulthood, these children are magnetic. You feel something otherworldly about them. Their eyes hold a depth that seems older than their years. They speak softly, dream vividly, and often love too hard. But there's a distance behind the warmth, a veil you can never quite lift, because while you're here, they're half somewhere else. Their body is present, but their soul is still visiting the place that once saved them. Fantasy becomes both medicine and poison. It softens the edges of pain, but also isolates the one who uses it. When fantasy is your first language, reality will always sound foreign. You crave meaning, depth, emotion that feels cinematic. You fall for people who mirror your inner mythology, tragic, magnetic, complicated. And when they inevitably fall short of the script your mind has written, you feel betrayed, even though they never knew the story they were acting in. It's not manipulation, it's memory. The fantasy child was once the director of their own safety. They choreographed emotional survival, scene by scene. So, in adulthood, they subconsciously direct everything: conversations, relationships, moods, trying to replicate that fleeting sense of control that once kept them alive. Fantasy, in its early form, is a miracle. It's the psyche's rebellion against despair. But over time, it becomes a cage made of beauty. You start confusing pain with passion, longing with love, melancholy with meaning. And every time life feels too simple, too real, you quietly retreat back into the dream. The psychology of this lies deep in the default mode network, the part of the brain that lights up when we daydream, imagine, reflect. For most people, this network quiets when the task at hand demands focus. But for those who grew up escaping reality, it stays lit, even when life demands presence. It's not a flaw, it's a survival mechanism that never learned how to rest. Fantasy children often become creators, writers, healers, artists, visionaries. They learn to turn pain into art, grief into gold. But many don't realize that every masterpiece they make is also an act of mourning. Each story, painting, or poem is a message to the self they had to leave behind. Creation becomes communion, a way to speak to the one who once lived in their imagination full time. And yet, there's a deep, aching exhaustion that comes with constantly living between worlds. You're grounded, but only barely. Reality feels too rigid. Fantasy feels too fragile. You're always negotiating between logic and longing. You want to trust life, but you spent too long designing your own. Psychologically, this is dissociation with artistry. It's not the cold, detached kind. It's warm, vibrant, even romantic. It's daydreaming as emotional anesthesia. It's detachment wrapped in beauty. The fantasy child doesn't disappear into nothingness. They disappear into color. They vanish into imagination, not to escape the world, but to remember what it could have been. But there comes a moment in every fantasy child's life, a threshold where the dream begins to feel too small. Because while fantasy protected you, it also paused you. You begin to sense a loneliness that no story can solve. The worlds you once built now echo. The characters that once comforted you go silent. The mind, once your safe place, starts to feel like a cage. This is where the real healing begins. When you realize you don't have to keep escaping to survive, you start reintroducing your body to safety. You learn to ground not just through imagination, but through sensation, through breath, texture, sunlight, sound. You start to teach your nervous system that reality now is not the same place it once was. It's here that fantasy transforms from avoidance to alchemy. The same imagination that saved you now begins to create for others. You write stories that make people feel seen. You build art that reminds the world what tenderness looks like. You give language to feelings others don't know how to name. And in doing so, you bridge your two worlds, not by abandoning the dream, but by weaving it into the real. This is the sacred evolution of the fantasy child. They become creators of safety, architects of beauty where none existed before. Their empathy is vast, their perception almost psychic, their art magnetic, because they are no longer escaping pain, they are transforming it. But make no mistake, healing doesn't mean the fantasy dies. It means the fantasy expands. It stops being a hiding place and becomes a canvas. The same world that once exiled you now becomes your palette, and you begin to paint your life with the colors that once only existed in your mind. Still, there's grief in that transition, because letting go of fantasy as refuge feels like betrayal. That world held you when no one else did. It was your secret parent, your invisible friend, your emotional oxygen. So, when you begin to live without it, fully, consciously, it feels like a death. You're mourning the home you built to survive, and that mourning deserves reverence, not ridicule. Fantasy was never delusion. It was the soul's rebellion against abandonment. It was your nervous system crafting sanctuary out of synapses. And now, as an adult, you can honor that without disappearing into it. You can be here, embodied, grounded, and still carry that inner light, that technicolor sensitivity, that ancient imagination. The child who escaped to survive becomes the adult who creates to thrive. They stop longing for someone to find them in their dream. Instead, they bring the dream here. They bring softness into the world's sharp edges. They bring wonder back to the ordinary. They become the bridge between fantasy and form, between heaven and human. The fantasy child was never broken. They were always a creator in training, and their imagination, once their only defense, becomes their gift to the collective. Thank you for sitting with me, for wandering through this world between worlds. If you were ever the child who escaped into daydreams to feel safe, if you built invisible homes to survive visible pain, I hope you know this. Your imagination wasn't an accident. It was brilliance. It was your nervous system's poetry, your psyche's masterpiece. You don't have to tear that world down. You just have to open the door and invite yourself back home. You can be here, fully present, and still carry the infinite within you. You can live your dream, not just in your mind, but in your hands, your heart, your breath. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who's still half living in the clouds, someone who sees too much, feels too deeply, dreams too vividly. Remind them they're not broken, they're brilliant, and their fantasy was never a flaw. It was the first sign of their genius. Until next time, stay soft, stay awake, keep your feet on the ground, but never lose your sky.